fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. In this podcast, we look to have a series of conversations with contemporary thinkers to try and understand the complex and many ramifications of architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, planning, the built environment in general, and try and think about these subjects in ways that are not immediately intuitable to those of us who are in the design professions. Today I'm talking to an old friend of mine from old Cornell days, the sociologist Amita Baviskar. She has just written a book on her experiences of living and working in Delhi, where she tries to unpack what citizenship, ecology, and social movements should be, could be, in her new book called Uncivil City. I had a great conversation with her, and I hope you enjoy it as well. First of all, welcome to Architecture Talk. Amita, it's very nice to talk to you again after quite a long time. I remember our times at Cornell very fondly. All the great exchanges we had in the art squad and other places in the great spaces of Cornell. And you have been here in Seattle at the University of Washington at least a couple of times, no?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, as our guest, we have connected a few times around then. And now I'm very excited to see here in front of me, your new book is out, Uncivil City. And that, of course, caught my attention right away because I found you writing about the city. And the city is part of my world and certainly the world of Architecture Talk. I'm excited to have this conversation. Earlier you have done a lot of work in environmental and social justice, the Narmada Bachao Andolan in the West. A lot of well-known conversations around that. But now you have decided to work on a city. Why the move to from more rural ecological practices to the city? How did that come about?
Well, Vikram, I have to then go back to the late 1990s,
Uh-huh.
a time when I was living in Delhi and working in Delhi, teaching at Delhi University.
Right.
While my work continued to be in central India and, as you said, in the Narmada Valley, a place of forests with a river, and all my focus was on the sorts of ways in which people's everyday lives and identities were built around their struggles for land,
Right.
for access to the river, for forests, and so on. And yet I was living in the city which surrounded me, and you know Delhi, so
Yeah.
you know just quite how intense the experience of living in Delhi is. It's a texture that completely surrounds you,
Yes.
both in wonderful ways, but also deeply frustrating and at times appalling ways. So I felt a certain kind of dissonance that, I live in the city and what I study is the countryside,
Right.
which is, of course, a legitimate topic for study. But I wondered how I could take the environmental questions about people's rights and claims over nature, about their relationships with nature into the city. And it didn't seem to me to be a particularly easy question to answer.
Right.
Because I'm talking about a time in India when, in fact, the urban environment was barely studied at all.
Exactly.
Of course, now there's been a huge surge of work around it, but at that time there was very, very little. And I'd wonder, what is nature in the city? Is it this tree? Is it a garden?
What is nature in the city for you?
Nature in the city for me is more than just looking for pretty patches of greenery,
Yeah.
or thinking about the river that passes through the city.
So it's not the romantic landscape of the park.
No, it is, of course, partly that, but it is also the way in which nature itself has been transformed into a built environment.
Mm-hmm.
And all the ways in which rural people deal with nature, not just as something which is a source of aesthetic pleasure
Mm-hmm.
or a place of recreation, but as a source of livelihoods and survival.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to find out whether in the urban environment too we see those connections.
Yeah.
And so I became very interested in the ways in which nature is transformed into a habitat for city
Yeah.
dwellers.
Yeah.
And the same questions that I probed in rural contexts, which are about inequality of access,
Right.
about social justice, those came to be important for me in the urban context as well, even though what I was looking at wasn't necessarily nature as conventionally defined. I ended up looking at urban space.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up looking at the commons, not in the sense of pastures or forests or rivers, but the commons in terms of the things that as city dwellers we could share,
Right.
or in fact, which certain people were being excluded from by the changing ways in which the city was developing.
I impute from your title of your book that you have some kind of contention with the idea of the city and civil society. I mean, those, of course, are terms that are etymologically linked, right? From city, we get
Yeah.
citizenship, and from citizenship, we get civil society, and civitas and civics, and so on and so forth. But your title is
Hmm.
Uncivil City. So unpack that a little bit for us. What is it that you're driving at here?
Well, in some ways, the idea of people as citizens
Mm-hmm.
is deeply ingrained in the idea of the city.
Mm-hmm.
The city as a space of freedom is something that great Indian political thinkers and leaders like B.R. Ambedkar,
Hmm.
who represents the Dalits or the former untouchable castes,
Right.
would write about. I mean, he had a deep contempt and critique for the idea of the village
Yeah.
as a place of communitas, a place where people live together in harmony, which was to some extent the idea that inspired Mahatma
Correct.
Gandhi's vision of development, right?
And he thought Indian society needed to be changed dramatically. Yes.
Yeah, and so also the idea, not just in Indian political thinking, but rather in Enlightenment thought as well,
Right. Correct.
the idea of the city as a place of, as you said, civitas,
Mm-hmm.
has been something to aspire towards.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Indian cities, perhaps more generally cities in the global south,
Right.
but certainly in the case of Delhi, what we
Mm-hmm.
find is the denial of citizenship. And what I argue in the book is that, the idea of citizenship is often rooted around claims to rights which are directed towards the state.
Right.
Yet the idea of civility is far deeper, and it's about our relationships with our fellow citizens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's India's deeply unequal social and economic structure that I think
Mm-hmm.
is as much at play in what makes Delhi such a troubling landscape. It's not just the denial of rights of citizens by the state, but it's also the ways in which class and caste, religion, gender, uh, are ways in which are the prisms through which we treat each other. We see each other differently and we treat each other differently and often savagely. Hence the idea of the uncivil city here.
Tell us about that example you have in the opening of your book.
Well, this was an incident that really got me thinking about what the city is. This was in a North Delhi affluent neighborhood
Uh-huh.
where somebody who one of the homeowners went out in the morning to take his dog for a walk
Mm-hmm.
in a piece of open land
In
that
a park.
the house
Yeah.
owners thought of as a
Yeah.
park. And there he came across this young man who was walking away with a bottle of water in his
Mm-hmm.
hands. And that's, of course, a sign of somebody who'd been out defecating
Right.
in the open.
Right.
And this homeowner was just outraged that his park
His
could
part.
be used for such a disgusting function.
That's right.
And so a group of homeowners, he called people out, a little crowd gathered, and they beat this young man to death.
Mm.
And this man, Dilip, happened to be somebody who had come to visit Delhi to see the Republic Day parade.
So see the spectacle of citizenship. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. To see the spectacle of citizenship. But he was staying with his uncle, who happened to be an industrial worker,
Mhm.
who lived in a shanty town, an unauthorized settlement which was squatting on public land,
Mhm.
and where you had people, with their very modest ramshackle homes,
Mhm.
which they'd built themselves, and no
Of
toilets.
course.
So for this young man, what that open space was a place to
Right.
defecate. The irony of it was that the homeowners had actually built a wall between their homes and these squatter settlements.
Mhm.
But that wall was broken,
Mhm.
not only to allow people access to the park to defecate, but also because all the workers, the maid servants, the domestic workers who cleaned homes, looked after the children, they lived in that squatter
Mhm.
settlement.
Mhm.
So this is to me the way in which in Delhi there is both this utter dependence
Mhm.
on the lives of very vulnerable poor people
Mhm.
who are kept in a state of vulnerability because they don't have legal rights to the places where they stay,
Mhm.
and yet there is this complete denial of their citizenship rights. So this is what got me going into thinking about, well, what is this conflict? Is this environmental politics? I mean, is urban space an environmental issue? Is having a toilet an environmental issue?
Right. Now this person got thrashed and beaten up and died, didn't he?
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
that's right. He was killed.
Yeah. And you raised the sort of an interesting discussion that often enough a lot of literature on subaltern practices, let's say, sort of seems to focus on the rights of subaltern people like migrant workers. But you seem to have you want to draw a complex relationship between that and what you're talking about, a sort of a broader ecology. I mean, the idea of civility connected to ecology, it seems you're making some kind of an argument that these need to be balanced. It's not just a question of rights and agencies, but that ecology requires a certain kind of interdependence amongst, let's say, even classes of people. Is that what you're arguing?
Absolutely. I think you put that really well. That there is an urban ecology which is of relationships between people which are fundamentally unequal, and yet there is that interdependence.
Hmm.
It's an interdependence that is rarely acknowledged and treated with respect. In fact, it's a perfect analogy. In fact, with how we treat the biophysical world as well. That there's interdependence, and we perform such violence.
What do you mean by biophysical world? Can you explain that term?
By the biophysical world, I mean the soil, the air, the water,
Uh,
flora and fauna,
mhm.
all the sort of natural living elements that surround
I
us.
see. I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So just as with the natural world upon which we depend,
Hmm.
we treat it with great
Hmm.
disrespect.
Right.
So what I'm arguing in the book is that we treat fellow citizens with an equal amount of disrespect, often bordering on exploitation and outright violence.
I mean, one might say that that's because we see the social order as a kind of a biophysical manifestation of so of the world. Is that how would you read that?
Well, I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
naturalize the injustices that exist in Indian society,
Mm.
but I would agree with you that they are really
Right.
normalized. That for a lot of people, this is just how it
Correct.
is, and this is what they must live with.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that actually raises the question or the big difference I saw between the city and the countryside,
Uh-huh.
because when I worked in the Narmada Valley in the early 1990s,
Hmm.
there was just great exhilaration, because here were people who were, truly among the most vulnerable in India. These were very, very poor Adivasis or members of, scheduled tribes who lived in these forested hills.
Right.
And yet they had come together in a powerful movement against a large dam
Right.
to defend their lives, their land, their river. And they had managed to bring together two central concerns for our times: social justice and environmental conservation or preservation.
Right.
So, this idea of ecological justice, for which poor people fight because they're actually on the front line dealing with the destruction of nature and defending, the little that they have and asking for more, was to my mind the model of what ecological justice is all about. And yet, what I saw in Delhi was precisely the opposite. Because in the 1990s, Delhi had what I call bourgeois environmentalists or upper middle class citizens.
Like you and me.
Exactly, people like you and
Uh-huh.
me, who are privileged by birth, by education, who believe that they care for the
Sure.
environment, and who had launched a series of campaigns to try and clean up the city.
Swatch.
But their vision, yes, Swachh Bharat, or rather clean and green
Right.
Delhi. But their attempts to try and clean up the city in order to make Delhi world class had the most horrendous effects on poor people, because cleaning up the air meant closing down factories.
Uh-huh.
So people lost their jobs. Cleaning up the river in Delhi, the river Yamuna, meant, quite weirdly enough, that poor people's settlements, squatter settlements, were razed to the ground, demolished. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people were within weeks evicted from their homes that they had built along the waterfront.
Right.
Uh, so the fact that the cause of, saving the environment was here completely cut off from the idea that the city should be a space for everyone
Right.
was what got me thinking about how the uncivil city actually operates as a place where poor people cannot protest against the injustice that they have to contend with. So unlike the Narmada Valley, where people are united in a social movement, in this book I look at why it is that poor people in the city, whose presence is absolutely vital to the city, and if they stopped working they could cripple the city, right?
Right.
But they don't come together and fight. And I look at the ways in which then ecological justice has become an elitist concern in the city, and what the fallout of that is.
The neoliberalists would probably argue. I'm thinking, let's say, for instance, like the people who have done the Sabarmati riverfront waterfront project, right? I'm sure you're aware of
Hmm.
that. That somehow this is a production of the city, production of the physical city, and that the production of the physical city has to, advance. Marshall Berman argues, and many modernists would argue that there is always collateral costs to be paid. So, a well worn argument. How would you respond to that in this context, in terms of your argument? What's the difference between this argument and your argument that subaltern practices have to be balanced against a broader civil ecological order?
Well, I think, Vikram, that I see it as having two different
Okay.
dimensions. One, that in the city, in Delhi, from the 1990s onwards, as you know, India has been going through a period of economic liberalization,
Correct.
so that spaces that were earlier much more state controlled
Right.
are gradually being opened up to private enterprise. So, the kind of riverfront development that you're talking about for
Yeah.
Ahmedabad is also being attempted in Delhi. And I have a chapter in the book where I talk about what's happened to the Yamuna
Right.
riverfront. And I describe how what used to be the commons, where people of all kinds had access to the riverfront. Partly, some of them were for farmers, there were others who were living there on the embankments. There were others who would, defecation is another function that, certain secluded areas of the riverfront provided, etc. There were ways in which all kinds of people could access the commons and use them in socially accepted ways. And what happened in the 1990s was a concerted move to take these commons and to commodify the land that they represented. Because that's a time when the river and the riverfront began to be seen as real estate. So I come to the second part of what you asked about, which is the idea that this is actually an attempt to improve the city by improving its public spaces. And who would one would think a riverfront embankment like in London or in Paris. I mean, that seems to be like the quintessential commons, doesn't it?
That is what we are emulating theoretically, yes.
Yeah, we're trying to emulate that, except that what's actually going on here is a form of enclosure because all kinds of poor people and the things that they use these areas for get excluded from the new consuming public. So if one looks at what's actually being built on the Yamuna embankment, where people who were living there were poor people's squatter settlements were removed and they were not compensated. They were not given alternative housing anywhere else. We see that these places now include government buildings, big stadiums, which were used for the Commonwealth Games and which are now off limits to poor people or, in fact, any people at all. There's a shopping mall. So there's all kinds of new developments. There are high-rise luxury apartments which were built, again, to house athletes who came during the Commonwealth Games in 2010, but which have since been sold off to just very rich people. So all of these things make the city look a certain way, and the look is that of developed metropolis, a sort of Singapore aesthetic. But these are places. This aesthetic is something which is achieved at the cost of excluding a whole set of people, and we see that the idea of the city as of city spaces as being the commons, of being things that the public can enjoy, has actually shrunk into creating more commodified places, places where people with money can enjoy themselves, but certainly not the ordinary everyday citizen.
So, say I was the authorized planner architect of the entire waterfront, magically, and you were my sociologist citizen consultant on this project. What would you put in my brief as necessary? I mean, obviously, we want participative, engaged processes. But what would you put down as, here are the things that biophysically or physically must be there so that there's the possibility of a vibrant commons?
Well, I'd say, first of all, let's clean up the river. And the river Yamuna in Delhi is basically today just sewer. It's just carrying all the sewage from, here's the irony, from the developed parts of the city, which have sewage systems, except that sewage flows directly into the river. So poor people get blamed for, shitting on the riverbanks. But the real shit that's going into the river is coming out of the kinds of, developed Delhi Development Authority kinds of neighborhoods that I happen to live in. So if we are to clean up the river, that means putting in effluent treatment plants that actually work and putting them in on a scale where they manage to catch all the sewage and treat it.
So that's an engineering technology solution.
That's a technology solution, but it's not a solution that's going to happen. And we know this because, there have been all kinds of Supreme Court orders, all kinds of elaborate foreign funded plans to try and clean up the river. It hasn't happened because none of the people who matter actually use the river for anything or even look at it. So, we've just turned our backs on the river and just treat it as a convenient conduit to carry all our waste and all our muck.
Okay, suppose we get Gates Foundation funding to clean up the river, then what else would be needed?
Yeah, so the funding isn't the issue. The issue really is organization on a scale that would allow the river to be treated in a decentralized manner. Catch the sewage when it is entering the sewer rather than at the tail end when it's flowing into the river and so on. But okay, so say we clean up the river. I think the second thing, and this is tremendously important, and I think it's an appalling failure that is absolutely disgraceful, is that we haven't provided legal, affordable housing that's decent housing for poor people in Delhi.
Okay. So you would locate that all at the commons, in the commons of the
Um,
riverfront?
n- no, I wouldn't. I'd actually look at all the other public
Uh-huh.
lands, which, as you know, the Development
Mhm.
Authority acquired all the lands of villagers in Delhi
Right.
state, their agricultural lands, in order to preemptively acquire them in order to later build upon them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at what they actually built, there's a huge asymmetry in the numbers of houses built for well to do people
Mm-hmm.
and what they built for what are called EWS, so economically weaker
Right, right.
sections. So we don't need to have social housing on the riverfront. In fact, it's inadvisable to do that because these are places which are prone to flooding, and the land can subside because it's silt. It's not sitting on anything solid by way of rock. But there's a lot of land that the city government agencies already
Mm-hmm.
have that could be used for housing that's decent, that's close to where people work.
Right.
And so, if I was playing architect, planner, goddess, that's where I would put my
Okay.
emphasis. And then I would, think of consultative ways that are sensitive to how people use public
Mm-hmm.
spaces. And I would make sure that the commons remain the commons and that the floodplain remains a floodplain.
I
So
see.
it should be, part of it could be maintained as a wetland. Part of it should be, an area where people can, learn about what it is to have a great river running through the city. Instead of this great hurry to, embank it and to concretize it in such a way that it's not at all a monsoon river anymore. In fact, it's become a risk to the city because it's in danger of breaching its banks.
Mm-hmm.
Because we haven't left it the kind of space it needs in order to, expand and contract as the seasonal rhythms
Right.
shape it.
So it's a ecological conservation kind of a vision. And that I think, would certainly make sense to me because here we are talking about a system called a river. Let's turn to the sort of a different example, which is this current controversy about the state's national identity path, which was the former Queensway or Rajpath redevelopment, and kind of a response to that in the form of the Lokpath movement, I understand.
Yes.
Here there is no river. What would be your sense of constructing a commons here? What do you think about this development project, and what would be your critique or discussion about it in terms of the commons or anything else that you would like to bring up?
Well, I think it's interesting that what was, that central vista
Hmm.
of the empire
Yes.
when New Delhi was built in the early 1900s. I think their mission was very much to impress upon the
Right.
populace the majesty of imperial
Right.
power. So, Raisina Hill, where the president's palace was built, looked out on
Hmm.
the old walled city of Shahjahanabad, which was below, and so
Right.
on. So the layout of New Delhi was very much about proclaiming the power of Britain as a colonizing power.
Right.
But I think what's interesting, and that is the change that has happened since
Hmm.
independence, because not only did we rename Kingsway and Queensway
Right.
Rajpath, or the way of the state, and Janpath, the way of the
Hmm.
people, but I think we appropriated those places and made them into an urban commons.
Hmm.
So, you in the winter on a sunny day, which Delhi nowadays doesn't have very many of, I'm
Right.
afraid, you can go out to the lawns of the India Gate and sit and, eat roasted peanuts. And any summer
Hmm.
evening, you find just masses and masses of people who are out there to enjoy the coolness, to eat an ice
Hmm.
cream. These are now our urban commons. And I think the kind of scenario where these places are transformed
Hmm.
needs to respect that these are our grandest public spaces. These are places of open vistas and shady trees where people just come to hang out, and especially on national
Right.
holidays, Republic Day, Independence Day. These are really places where one can celebrate the fact of just being a citizen because they're really open to everyone. Um, families from the walled city take the metro and come in, and in the evenings, the place is absolutely abuzz with people just enjoying those spaces. So I think what the replanning of this area, which is now proposed,
Hmm.
seems to do is to take over these places and reappropriate them for the government, because the plan is to build more government offices
Correct.
there. I think one needs to leave these as public places, as the commons. And if you have any buildings, then they need to be set back, just as in Washington D.C.
Hmm.
You have buildings which are set back, but they're all public buildings. They're
Right.
museums. They're museums about different things which are important for a nation. And I don't see why we should also not use this space to celebrate our democracy and all the things that we should be proud of,
Right.
rather than build grandiose government buildings which are, for most people, oppressive spaces that you never want to go into if they could help it.
So the argument from the other side that is usually made is, look, these buildings are whatever 70, 80 years old, and the government of India has vastly increased, needs to be a lot more representational. We need a lot more space, a lot more ministries. We are working in outdated structures. So I would impute that what you are arguing is that while all that is true, it does not make sense to develop the central vista, let's say, of the nation now in the form of a statist axis of power, right? And that those buildings should be located elsewhere, and at least there should be some effort to produce a site for citizen activity, which you're calling the commons, as the central space of the city. Is this one way to think about this?
Absolutely. I think this is terribly important. And the reason why this doesn't seem to be, why, we need architects and planners to mobilize and say this, is because of what is a fundamental problem with the ways in which we make decisions like this, is that there's been absolutely no
Right.
consultation. And this to me is again the kind of, incivility and the absence of citizenship that happens, that marks Delhi. That really important decisions
Right.
that we're going to be living with for at least several decades,
Hmm.
or as long as concrete
Right.
lasts. We're going to be stuck with these buildings, and yet the government has held its own. It's made up its own mind without talking to anybody other than firms of architects. I mean, to my mind, that is completely the wrong way of going about figuring out what city spaces should look
And,
like.
and, and it seems, from what I understand, I'm sitting far away, that they haven't even really talked to architects and planners either. It's sort of been pre cooked and more or less pre assigned.
Exactly. But I would say that even if it were to be a consultation with architects and planners, this is still too important a decision to be left only
The,
to technical
right, right,
specialists.
yeah.
Part of my argument in the book is the fact that Delhi is supposed to be a planned
Hmm.
environment, and yet planning has been absolutely blind to the fact that there are all of these people who work to keep the city alive and thriving and prospering,
Hmm.
whose basic needs for shelter and a whole set of civic
Hmm.
amenities are not catered for because the planners simply didn't want to see
Right.
them. I mean, this is something that you know from your own work on
Yeah, yeah.
Chandigarh, that it's the ultimate planned city. But where was the space then for the domestic worker, for the guy who irons your
Yeah.
clothes, for the vegetable vendor, and all the little myriad little trades that any city spawns in India all the time?
This informal sector or the informal city, which is argued to be a constitutive element of the southern city. I mean, the counter argument sometimes that runs is that, and I think you talked about this also a little bit, also, is that one has to also assume that the people who are part of this entire informal city also have an aspiration, that we cannot obviously romanticize them. We, as professional architects and planners, don't, besides the government and state, of course, which has the real and important responsibility, must work towards some kind of notion of progress.
Yeah, I think there's been, shifts in the ways in which people think about this large, sprawling hive of activities and processes that we call the informal
Mhm.
economy. Or maybe, it's not that there are shifts, but there's just different points of
Right.
view. Well, I mean, in the modern city, there is not supposed to be this kind of unregulated activity, right? I mean, everything is supposed to be regulated with designated spaces for everything and so
Mhm.
forth. Every planned city, and this is especially true of Delhi, has spawned what we might call its ugly twin, which is the informal
Right.
city. Every planned neighborhood in Delhi has a little satellite
Ah.
slum, which is where all the services and the people providing the services come
Mhm.
from. So, a number of people advocate that we recognize informality as something which is inevitable,
Mhm.
and not only recognize it, but actually celebrate it in ways. So, a lot of people will say, look, this is a sign of
Right.
resilience, that people will, use their own resources creatively and
Mhm.
innovatively and will produce homes and so on. We find this sometimes in accounts of these large slum agglomerations, like, say, Dharavi in
Right.
Mumbai, that look, it's a tribute to what human ingenuity can produce, that out of this disgusting place, people actually live here and work here. Isn't it wonderful? You actually have tours of these slums like you do in the favelas
Right.
of Latin America or in the townships of South
Mhm.
Africa. But there is, as you're saying, this important dimension to it, which is that this is not how people necessarily want to
Correct.
live. They want legal rights, they want security, they want a house that doesn't tumble down because it's on a hillside or get flooded with
Right.
sewage in the
Yeah.
monsoons. Um, so I think the trick is to allow people that degree of self expression, that they can build what best suits their
Mhm.
needs, but under conditions which allow them safety and structural
Mhm.
stability, and all the other things which more privileged people take for granted. We expect our homes to be compliant with fire safety
Correct.
codes. I think everybody has a right to live in a home like that. Why should we think that people who live in slums should have substandard housing?
So that starts to become an impossible question. Now you are in, how do we build that city? And here I mean it physically.
I think there are some beginnings that we see and some inspirational things we see in, say, South Africa, which has done much more to build legal and affordable housing than India
Mhm.
has. But I think we also have to think about the city not simply as it is, but as it has the processes that have led it to be what it has
Right.
become. And by which I mean are the relationship between the city and the countryside.
Mhm.
Why is it that people would rather come from the village and settle in some little tiny square inch of land in a city slum, without access to clean water, without access to
Mhm.
sanitation, just in order to make a living? I mean, there's something frighteningly wrong in India, where 60% of the population still depends on the land, on agriculture in some form or the
Uh-huh.
other. But the majority of them can't make a living off the land through the year. So they migrate to cities seasonally, many of them stay on. So there's something very wrong about the terms of trade between agriculture and industry, between where industries happen to be located. Most of them are in cities, but in the way in which the service sector is growing, and again, the growth is happening in towns and in cities. So it's a very pattern of urbanization and the way in which it links to the larger ecological and economic landscape of the
Mhm.
country that we need to think about.
So you're saying, of course, a new industry and sort of economic opportunities are developing only, it seems, in the city. So flesh this out for me a little bit more. This town and country push and pull factors, which was a sort of we used to talk a lot about in the 70s planning kind of thing. What is the relationship between these things as you see that today and moving ahead in India, let's say? Has nothing changed, or describe to me why this person leaves the countryside and the village to come and live in the slum and city.
I think what's happened over the years is, of course, with our rising
Hmm.
population, people now have access to smaller and smaller pieces of land in the
Okay.
countryside. And there has been an absolute failure to make that land more productive by investing in all kinds of different ways by which you can retain water, land management practices that would allow you to retain the fertility of the soil and so on. Agriculture isn't something that people can make a living from anymore for the most
Right.
part. And along with that is the neglect of rural areas in terms of providing
Hmm.
services. If you want to get a good education in
Hmm.
India, you can't stay in a village. You have to put your children in a small town at least so that they can go to a decent
Hmm.
school. If you want decent health care, you can't get that in a village. You have to go to, again, a town or a
Right.
city. So there's a huge difference in the ways in which basic services and social welfare is made available to people in rural and in urban
Hmm.
areas. So with the decline of agriculture, with this deprivation of basic necessities that people experience in rural areas, there's been this profound loss of nerve in the idea of the village or the countryside as a place to be
No.
in. People don't want to farm. Nobody wants to live there. They'd all rather be in a city, even if they're living in a tiny one room tenement which they share with 20 other people, because that's where you're earning something a little bit more. You could be a part of the precariat.
Hmm.
You're working as a security guard, you could be working as a courier delivery person. Those are the kinds of jobs people get. Women work as domestic
Hmm.
workers on construction sites. And even that little insecure work is something that people would rather do because things are so appallingly bad back home. And I think recognizing and in the long term addressing this great imbalance, and it's an enormously challenging task, I realize
Yeah.
that, is however crucial to making our cities better because we just can't cope with this great constant influx of people. Yeah, and the only way we can sort of accommodate them is by denying them all the sorts of things that they deserve and that they're entitled
Right.
to.
One of the phrases that I have been using is that urbanization is actually better described as deruralization.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly
Right.
so.
So that we must understand the constitutive relationship between the city and the countryside at large.
And as someone who works on environmental politics, what I see also is the ecological footprint of the
Hmm.
city expanding onto the countryside in ways which are deeply worrying. So, for instance, if you look at where Delhi gets its water
Hmm.
from, all the way from high dams in the Himalayan
Right.
mountains. That's where Delhi is getting
Yeah.
water. If you travel south and west from
Hmm.
Delhi, the Aravalli Hills
Hmm.
now are, many of them have disappeared
Right.
altogether because of the demand for stone for construction for Delhi.
Right. 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 Yeah. There's a sucking sound into the city. Yeah. I mean, it's like like a vacuum cleaner, sort of destroying the entire surrounding landscapes. You sort of feel that here in America too. I mean, like these the prospering West Coast cities in New York and Austin, sort of 4 or 5 places, sort of sucking the life out of even the small towns in the U.S. So UN and everybody talks constantly. We are the urban century, and the sort of massive problems that we are going to be facing because of that. But as we move towards the end over here, I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit and ask you about these beautiful illustrations by Arijit Sen that are in your book. I must admit, most of the books that I read by sociologists and ecological scientists that come from the humanities and this don't usually have hand-drawn illustrations. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, Arijit Sen is one of India's best graphic
Yeah.
artists. And one of the absolutely spectacular things he's done is this gigantic mural in the Museum of Sikh History at Anandpur
Right.
Sahib, which is about life in Punjab. And I think people can go online and look it
Mm-hmm.
up, but to really experience the sheer wonder of what Arijit produces, one has to go to the museum and look at
Mm-hmm.
that. But I know Arijit from way back because when I'd written about the Narmada Valley and the struggle of people there to hold on to their lands and fight against this big
Mm-hmm.
dam. Part of what I did was to translate into
Mm-hmm.
English from
Mm-hmm.
Bhilali, which is their language, their creation myth, which is a beautiful story of how the river Narmada created the
I see.
world. And Arijit happened to come across
Mm-hmm.
it, and he was drawing what is said to be India's first full-length graphic novel,
Aha.
which was about this Narmada
Mm-hmm.
movement. The book is called A River of
Aha.
Stories, and as it happens, it's going to be republished this year in a new
I see.
edition. And so Arijit was doing the graphic novel at that time, and he incorporated bits from the Bhilala creation myth, the
Mm-hmm.
Gayana, into his story. And because I have a very neat handwriting, so Arijit said, "Hey, why don't you do the lettering for my comic
Aha.
book?" So, which is what I
Aha.
did. And so, we've been good friends from a long time
Aha.
back. And I was lucky enough to this
Mm-hmm.
time get this great gift from Arijit, which is the to be able to use his illustrations, which I think perfectly capture not just the kind of images of the city that I think are interesting and
Mm-hmm.
arresting, but also the feeling of the city, the feel of
I
Delhi.
see.
I think he does that beautifully, and the cover of is also something that he has
Oh,
done.
wonderful. Well, it's a beautiful book. It's just coming out, and I'm encouraging everybody to.
And it's
It's
out.
out. It's
It's
out.
out.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. Well, it's available everywhere,
Yes.
guys. So go buy it. Amita, thank you so much for having this conversation with me on Architecture Talk.
My pleasure, Vikram. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is architect and fellow architectural thinker Sami Prouty. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. And if you did, please do remember to subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have suggestions for new topics or guests. You can reach out to us via our website or Instagram. See you next time.